If you walk into the maternity ward of any modern hospital, you will eventually find yourself standing in front of a large glass window. Behind it are rows of identical clear bassinets, infants wrapped in identical blankets, monitored by identical machines, while adults stand on the other side of the glass, watching. We are told this is simply how medicine works. It is sterile, it is safe, it is normal. But the first time this exact arrangement was presented to the public, it wasn't in a hospital. It was at an amusement park, right between the animal exhibits, the Ferris wheel, and the cotton candy stands. You bought a ticket, you walked inside, and you looked at rows of living human infants kept in glass boxes. This isn't a rumor, it isn't a fringe theory. It was one of the most profitable attractions at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. And it wasn't just St. Louis, it was Chicago, Buffalo, Omaha, Coney Island. For decades, the public paid admission to stare at premature babies living inside steel and glass incubators. History has a very clean explanation for this. We are told that a man named Martin Cooney, a rogue medical pioneer, was trying to save premature infants that traditional hospitals had given up on. Because the medical establishment rejected his machines, he turned to the fairgrounds to fund his work. The admission fees paid for the nurses, the crowds paid to keep the babies alive. It is remembered as an eccentric but beautiful piece of humanitarian history. And maybe it started that way. There are people who have argued exactly that, and they have the archived newspaper clippings to back it up. I didn't have any reason to doubt it. I actually went into the municipal archives looking for the original blueprints of the incubator pavilions because I thought the engineering was interesting. I wanted to see how they managed the ventilation in a crowded fairground before modern air conditioning. But when you sit in a quiet room with the original photographs of these exhibits, when you stop reading the historical captions and just look at the physical architecture of what was built, something uncomfortable happens. Look at the layout, the brass rails keeping the public at a specific distance, the massive boiler systems pumping heated, purified air through intake pipes, the nurses in heavy, starched white uniforms standing rigidly behind the glass. They don't look like caretakers in an emergency ward. They look like technicians monitoring an assembly line. The visual language of the exhibit is entirely industrial. It is systematized. It doesn't look like a desperate, improvised rescue operation. It looks like a factory line being introduced to the public for the first time, dressed up as a medical miracle. I kept coming back to that thought, and I wasn't entirely sure why. It's easy to project modern anxieties onto old photographs. The past always looks a little cold. But then I started looking at the logistics, not the architecture, but the supply chain. An exhibit like the one at the 1904 World's Fair or the permanent installation at Coney Island didn't just run for a weekend. These attractions ran for months, sometimes years, open from morning until late at night. The pavilions were massive. They required a constant, visible population of infants to justify the ticket price. If the incubators were empty, the crowds stopped paying. A premature birth is a medical emergency. It is random, it is unpredictable. Even today, it is a localized crisis. A daily amusement park attraction requires reliable inventory. I spent 4 days in a library annex going through early 20th century demographic records. I was trying to find the intake logs. Where were the parents? If these were local babies rushed to the fairgrounds in the middle of the night by desperate families, there should be a paper trail of that panic. Admission records, transfer papers from local doctors. There are a few scattered anecdotes, a story here or there about a father running a baby across town in a shoebox, but those are individual stories. They don't scale. When you look at the sheer volume of infants required to keep these massive exhibits fully stocked across multiple cities simultaneously year after year, the numbers become very difficult to reconcile with the official explanation. You cannot run a continuous, high-volume, multi-city commercial exhibition relying purely on the random chance of local premature births. If the supply was not arriving by chance, then it had to be arriving by some other mechanism. And that question, where exactly was the supply coming from, is one that the historical record never seems to answer directly. So where did the babies come from? That is the question I couldn't let go of, because once you start asking it seriously, the incubator exhibits stop looking like the main event. They start looking like the visible surface of something much larger.
If you step away from the world's fairs and look at the broader social infrastructure of the mid to late 19th century, you hit a statistical wall. Right around the same time these incubators were being perfected, there was a sudden massive explosion of large-scale orphanages across the Western world. They were called foundling hospitals, and the architectural footprint of these buildings was staggering. These were not small community homes, they were gigantic brick fortresses built to house thousands of infants and young children at a time. The official historical record explains this as a tragic byproduct of the Industrial Revolution: poverty, disease, and urbanization, leaving millions of children abandoned on the streets. That explanation is the accepted one. But when you sit down with the intake ledgers, it raises a question that is difficult to answer within the official framework. I was going through digitized records of a foundling asylum from the 1880s. You look at the columns, the handwritten names, the dates of arrival. Hundreds of children, sometimes thousands in a single year, flowing into these monolithic institutions. And the word foundling implies that they were found, abandoned on church steps, left in alleyways. But when you map the intake numbers against the local populations of the period, the proportions are harder to explain than the standard narrative suggests. What I want to be clear about is this: I cannot prove that the official explanation is wrong. What I can say is that the architecture raises a question the official explanation doesn't fully answer. You don't commission a building designed to process thousands of infants per year as an act of optimistic charity. The scale implies foreknowledge of volume. Whether that foreknowledge came from reasonable social projection or from something else entirely is precisely the question that the record seems uninterested in asking. Charity is the perfect disguise for industry. And when you frame these buildings as charitable sanctuaries, the volume stops being suspicious. No one questions it. No one asks why the architecture looks exactly like a factory, or why the children were dressed in identical uniforms, or why the intake logs are so vague about where these children actually came from. They were processed through what appears, at minimum, to be a highly systematized, state-managed childhood pipeline, operating in broad daylight under the language of welfare. Now I want to ask you to hold the image of those foundling hospitals in your mind, but put it aside for a moment, because I want to look at something else entirely. Look at early panoramic photography of major cities from the 1850s through the 1870s. San Francisco, Paris, St. Petersburg, Melbourne. The cameras were large, the exposure times were long, but the images survive. You see sprawling, monumental stone architecture, massive boulevards, complex infrastructure that would have taken decades to plan and build. And you see almost no one there. The streets are empty, the plazas are empty. The cities look abandoned, or more precisely, they look inherited, like the physical shell of a civilization was left intact, but the population that built it was no longer present. Now I want to be careful here, because there is a standard explanation for this, and it is not unreasonable. The long exposure times of early cameras simply didn't capture moving people. They blurred out of existence, leaving the streets looking deserted. That explanation exists. Historians point to it.
I am not in a position to disprove it, but I will say this: it sits beside the rest of the picture in an uncomfortable way. Because the long exposure argument accounts for moving crowds, it is less useful when you start noticing the absence of stationary carts, the empty windows, the sheer quietness of enormous urban centers that, according to the official record, were already fully inhabited. I am not telling you the cities were empty. I am telling you the photographs look like they might have been, and that the standard explanation, while plausible, does not fully dissolve that discomfort. What I want to propose, and I want to be explicit that this is speculation, not conclusion, is a framework that connects these images to the institutions we were just discussing. An incubator produces life. A foundling asylum stores life. But an industry of this scale, a network of child processing centers spanning multiple continents, only makes sense if there is a massive and sudden deficit of life to fill. You do not build a human factory unless you have a catastrophic need to repopulate something that has been emptied. That is where the documented record ends and interpretation begins. I cannot state as fact that the adults of the old world were removed. What I can do is look at the photographs of empty cities and then look at the exploding populations of infants in the asylums and observe that one, theoretically, solves the other. Whether it actually did is a question I cannot answer, but it is a question I find myself unable to stop asking. If you were, hypothetically, inheriting an empty and fully built world, a replacement population of adults would create problems. Adults have memories, they have histories. If they see a monumental building, they will ask who built it. Infants don't ask questions. A blank slate population does not remember the world before. So if you had the empty cities and you had the foundling institutions acting as holding tanks for a cultivated population, how would you distribute them? You would put them on trains. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were loaded onto trains on the east coast of the United States and shipped outward. This was called the Orphan Train movement. The official story is that philanthropic organizations were trying to get street children out of the crowded, dirty cities and place them with farming families in the expanding Midwest.
It is celebrated as the beginning of modern foster care, but when you look at the surviving photographs of these train stops, the atmosphere is freezing. You see children, sometimes toddlers, lined up on wooden railway platforms. They are wearing identical clothes. Adults walk down the line, inspecting them, checking their teeth, feeling their muscles. We call it adoption because that word makes us feel safe, but the documentation, in its structure and its language, looks less like a humanitarian relief effort and more like a freight manifest. The children were separated from their siblings. They were stripped of their names if they ever had them. They were handed over to strangers to work the land, build the towns, and inherit the empty spaces. They didn't have a past. They only had a destination. And this wasn't an isolated American experiment. Similar distribution networks were operating across Europe in the same period, moving thousands of children into rural areas, repopulating regions with a generation that had no bloodline connecting them to the land they were standing on. When you start to map the rail lines against the locations of the foundling hospitals and then overlay that with the incubator exhibits touring the world's fairs, a very specific machine begins to emerge. Whether that machine was designed or whether it simply evolved in response to genuine social crisis is the question at the center of all of this.
When you put all the pieces on the table, the official narrative begins to sound like a story we tell ourselves so we don't have to look at the mechanics. We have monumental, sparsely populated cities photographed in the mid-19th century. We have a simultaneous explosion of foundling asylums filled with infants of undocumented origin. We have a highly organized, state-sponsored railway system distributing hundreds of thousands of those children to specific geographical zones. And then, right at the turn of the century, we have the world's fairs. This is where the speculation becomes hardest to dismiss, not because the evidence is conclusive, but because the pattern is so consistent. Think about the psychological function of the world's fairs. These events were designed to show the public the future. They displayed the new electrical grids, the new machinery, the new architecture. They were, in a very deliberate sense, training grounds for the modern world. They taught people what to expect, what to accept, and what to call normal. By putting the incubators on display, right next to the steam engines and the electric lights, something very specific was being communicated to the public, whether intentionally or not. The industrialized management of human infants was being presented as progress, as spectacle, as something worth the price of admission. The crowds came, they paid, they looked at the rows of glass chambers containing living babies monitored by uniformed technicians, and they did not ask why this was at an amusement park. They did not ask where the babies came from. They did not ask who authorized this or what happened to the children when the fair closed. They watched, they nodded, they moved on to the next exhibit. I want to be careful not to overstate what that silence proves. People in 1904 were not uniquely credulous. They were ordinary.
They trusted the language of institutions, charity, medicine, welfare, progress, in the same way most people in most eras trust the language of institutions. The incubators were presented as a humanitarian miracle, and so that is what they appeared to be. But here is what I find genuinely difficult to dismiss. If the incubator exhibits were simply a medical curiosity, an eccentric pioneer's last resort for funding premature infant care, then why did the visual language of those exhibits look exactly like a factory? Why did the supply chain logic not hold up to basic demographic scrutiny? Why did the broader infrastructure of orphan trains, foundling hospitals, and child redistribution networks emerge simultaneously across multiple continents in the same narrow window of time? The official answer is convergent social reform. Every major Western nation independently developed the same systems for the same reasons at the same moment, because industrialization created the same problems everywhere. That is possible, I cannot rule it out. What I can say is that it is also consistent with a different explanation, one that the official record has never seriously entertained. That these systems did not emerge to manage a crisis of poverty, that they emerged to execute something else entirely. That the foundling hospitals were not built in response to abandoned children, but in anticipation of a population that needed to be built from scratch, routed into place, and given the language of charity so that no one would think to question the volume. I stopped looking for the original blueprints of the incubator pavilions after that. The engineering didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the pattern. And the pattern was this: a world that needed to be filled, a system that appeared to fill it, and a public that accepted the explanation it was given without demanding a different one. The children taken off those orphan trains grew up. They worked the farms, they built the roads, they fought the wars of the 20th century. They had children of their own. They became the grandparents and great-grandparents of people walking around today. There is a strange phenomenon in modern genealogy. If you talk to people who try to trace their family trees back through the 1800s, many of them hit a sudden, inexplicable dead end somewhere around the 1880s or 1890s. The paper trail stops. The names vanish. There are no birth certificates, no parish records, no immigration logs that hold up. It is as if their ancestors simply appeared, fully formed, boarding trains to the Midwest. I cannot tell you that this is proof of anything. Dead ends in genealogical records have many ordinary explanations: fires, floods, poor record-keeping, migration, war.
The absence of a document is not evidence of a conspiracy, but I will tell you what it looks like when you hold it next to everything else. It looks like the footprint of a population that was placed, not born. A generation that was cultivated, distributed, and handed a story about where it came from. A story clean enough and old enough that no one alive today thought to check it until now. The archives are quiet, and that quiet has two possible explanations. The first is that nothing unusual happened, and the records were simply lost to time the way records always are. The second is that the quiet is the record, that what was built in those decades was built to last, and the most important feature of the design was that it would never need to be explained. I keep coming back to this, and I'm not entirely sure why I find it so hard to let go of. Maybe because the violence of it, if it happened, is so quiet. There were no mass graves, no battlefields, just quiet rooms with cribs and trains moving through the night, and crowds of ordinary people paying admission to look at something they had no name for, and walking away feeling like they had witnessed something beautiful. The next time you decide to research your family tree and you follow the lines back to the late 1800s, pay attention to where the paper trail stops. Pay attention to the great-grandparents who seem to appear out of nowhere, with no parents of their own, boarding trains to the Midwest. And the next time you walk past a hospital maternity ward and you look through the glass at the rows of identical boxes, ask yourself why the scene feels so familiar. Ask yourself when you first learned not to find it strange. You are not just looking at a medical ward. You may be looking at the blueprint of a system that built the world you are standing in. A system that worked so completely, so quietly, and so long ago that its most lasting achievement was not the population it produced, but the fact that the population never thought to ask how it got here. Rows of identical clear bassinets, infants wrapped in identical blankets, monitored by identical machines. We are told this is simply how medicine works. Nobody asked why.